On November 17th, 2024, paramedics from the 119 emergency service received a call from an apartment in Paju, Gyeonggi province. The caller identified himself as a husband. His wife, he reported, was losing consciousness. She needed help immediately. What responders found inside that apartment would become one of the most disturbing cases of domestic abuse in recent South Korean history. A 37-year-old woman, married for a decade, living with her husband in what neighbors assumed was an ordinary home. But for months, perhaps longer, something unspeakable had been happening behind those closed doors. This is the story of Yoo Seon-ah, a pseudonym used to protect the victim's identity. This is about how she lived, what she endured, and the questions that remain about the man who was supposed to protect her. Questions about isolation, control, and a system that didn't intervene until it was far too late. What happened to Seon-ah forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, about cultural silence, and about the invisible suffering that can exist even in plain sight. Let's begin from the beginning. Yoo Seon-ah was 37 years old when she died on November 18th, 2024. Before that day, before the tragedy that would define her final months, she was remembered by those who knew her as lively, healthy, and genuinely kind to everyone she met. A thoughtful daughter who always worried about her mother before herself. A caring younger sister who never forgot her older sister's birthday. Friends described her as active, confident, outgoing, someone who brought energy into a room. She married Kim Dong-hun in 2016. They had been elementary school classmates, childhood friends who reconnected later in life, fell in love, and decided to build a future together. Dong-hun was an army sergeant at the time of his arrest. He served as a transportation officer for the 2nd Armored Brigade, 16th Tank Battalion, stationed in Gwangtanmyeon Township in the rural outskirts of Paju. When the case broke, he was in job transition training, preparing to leave military service. After their marriage, Seon-ah moved to Paju to be with her husband. She left her hometown behind, left her friends, started fresh in an unfamiliar place where she knew no one except him. The couple had no children, but they did have 2 dogs they cherished like family. By all accounts, from the outside, their life seemed simple but happy. In early 2024, during the Lunar New Year holiday, the entire family went on a 2-day trip together. It was Seon-ah's idea, according to family members. In photos from that trip, she appears smiling brightly. She looked healthy. She looked fine. The following fall, during Chuseok Korean Thanksgiving, the family saw her for what would be the last time in person. She seemed normal then, too. But something had happened the previous year that would fundamentally shift the balance of power in their relationship. In 2023, Seon-ah quit her job. Dong-hun later claimed his wife had experienced trouble with a coworker at her workplace. That's when she became depressed, he said. That's when everything changed. But when investigators examined messages Seon-ah had exchanged with friends around the time she quit, there were no signs of depression. She seemed perfectly normal, upbeat even. Not long after she left her job, Dong-hun contacted Seon-ah's family with concerning news. He told her mother that Seon-ah had developed a panic disorder. The mother was shocked. She called her daughter immediately. Seon-ah confirmed what her husband had told them. She said meeting people had become difficult for her. She promised she would visit when she felt better. She asked her family to be patient. But something didn't add up. When investigators later reviewed Seon-ah's complete medical records, there was no diagnosis of panic disorder anywhere, no diagnosis of depression, no psychiatric treatment of any kind. It wasn't a medical conclusion. It was only Dong-hun's opinion. From that point forward, Seon-ah gradually pulled away from everyone she knew. In Paju, she didn't belong to any social groups. She had no friends in the area. And after a car accident years earlier, she was too frightened to drive. In this unfamiliar city, miles from her family, with no independent transportation, the only person she could truly rely on was her husband. Criminal psychologists who later analyzed the case noted something significant. According to those who knew the couple, Seon-ah had originally been the one in control of the relationship. She was the active one, the confident one, the outgoing one. Dong-hun, by contrast, was quiet and would do anything his wife asked. But at some point, that dynamic completely reversed. 2 factors likely drove this shift. First, economic dependency. When Seon-ah quit her job in 2023, she became entirely financially dependent on Dong-hun. Second, the psychological isolation he manufactured around her supposed mental health problems. Whether or not she was really suffering from anxiety or depression, the balance of power had shifted entirely to him. Experts believe that once this reversal happened, Dong-hun may have started showing a completely different side of himself. What might have begun as emotional control could have escalated into verbal abuse, and eventually into physical violence. Acquaintances testified that while the couple seemed close on the surface, Dong-hun's drinking frequently led to arguments. He was normally quiet, they said. But when he drank, he sometimes became uncontrollable and violent. Seon-ah was becoming trapped, and no one on the outside could see it. The diaries, Seon-ah, kept revealed the depth of her psychological dependence on her husband. She wrote about wanting to be a good wife, about preparing to become a good parent someday, about her deep love for Dong-hun. But there was something else in those entries, something darker. She wrote that she didn't like being home when he wasn't there, that she felt incomplete without him nearby. These weren't the words of an equal partnership. They painted a picture of a one-sided relationship, one where Seon-ah had become completely psychologically dependent on the very person who was hurting her. Psychologists who reviewed the case suggested Seon-ah may have been trapped in a state of psychological manipulation, what experts call gaslighting. She may have come to believe that the only person who could solve her problems was her husband, even though he was the one causing them. One psychology professor made an important observation. Even if Seon-ah genuinely experienced depression or panic attacks, having a panic disorder doesn't make someone physically unable to move. Whatever was keeping her trapped in that apartment, it wasn't her own choice alone. Seon-ah's family desperately wanted to see her, but Dong-hun prevented it. He told his in-laws that her panic disorder was so severe that she would collapse when meeting people. "You shouldn't come," he insisted. He said he was taking good care of her. He told them not to worry, and the family believed him. They trusted their son-in-law. There was reason to trust him, at least on the surface. From their newlywed days through their entire marriage, Dong-hun had consistently sent messages to Seon-ah's family. Messages that appeared to show how well he was caring for his wife, photos, updates, reassurances. This wasn't a new habit he started only when Seon-ah withdrew from her family. He'd always done this, so it didn't trigger alarm bells. It was just Dong-hun being Dong-hun, or so they thought. Criminal psychologists later noted that Dong-hun displayed a disturbing pattern. He showed complete indifference to his wife's suffering in private. Yet at the same time, he consistently projected the image of an ideal, caring husband to the outside world. This wasn't accidental behavior. It was deliberate performance, carefully maintained, meticulously executed. But inside that apartment, something very different was happening. Something that would eventually be discovered in the worst possible way. How did no one notice? How could this continue for months without intervention? After the incident, investigators searched the apartment. On Dong-hun's desk, they found 2 handwritten letters from Seon-ah to her husband. The letters were heartbreaking. "You must be having such a hard time because of me, right? I'm sorry," one read. The letter mentioned him bringing up separation. Seon-ah had written multiple apologies. She was scared, she was afraid, and then this sentence, "Please take me to the hospital." She was begging to see a doctor. If it were just a cold, she could have gone herself, but clearly, she was in a state where she couldn't move on her own. "Can I ask you this favor?" she wrote. "I want to get some cold medicine and lip balm." She was asking permission for basic necessities, permission to get medical care. This wasn't the language of an equal partner. This was someone completely under another person's control. Profilers who examined these letters suggested that the panic disorder and depression Dong-hun claimed his wife suffered from may have been conditions he manufactured through psychological manipulation. In reality, she may have been unable to move for entirely different reasons. There was a strong possibility he had physically restrained her. By March 2024, warning signs were already appearing on Seon-ah's body. Delivery records showed that was when she started ordering gauze and bandages regularly through online shopping. She had wounds, and those wounds were getting worse. So did Dong-hun ever take his sick wife to the hospital? The family checked her medical records through the National Health Insurance Service. June 1st, 2024 was the last hospital visit on record. After that date, She only saw the inside of a hospital in the hours before she died. 5 months. For 5 months, while her body was deteriorating, while wounds were forming and worsening, Dong-hun did nothing to get his wife medical care. But here's a strange detail. He did take the dogs to the veterinarian. Receipts were found for September and October visits. He also took them for grooming on a regular basis. He even proudly sent photos of the well-groomed dogs to Seon-ah's family. He took such good care of the dogs. Why not his wife? While Seon-ah's family thought everything was fine, neighbors started noticing things that contradicted that narrative. Dong-hun was frequently seen entering the house carrying plastic bottles of soju, a Korean distilled beverage. Loud noises could be heard through the walls until 2 in the morning, almost every night. One neighbor was particularly blunt. "I never once saw the woman who lived there," the neighbor said. "I assumed they had divorced." Seon-ah was completely cut off from the world, trapped inside that house, unable to call for help, or unwilling to, or prevented from doing so. For 3 months, according to what Dong-hun himself initially told paramedics, he knew maggots were crawling over his wife's body, and he didn't call 119, Korea's emergency number. Why didn't he call sooner? One of the paramedics who responded to the November 17th call can still describe that day vividly. The details haven't faded. They may never fade. From the moment he opened the front door, he recoiled. An unbearable stench filled the entire house. It was the unmistakable smell of human waste and decay. Even standing in the entryway, the odor was bad enough that he had to cover his nose. He entered the main bedroom. At first, he couldn't see anyone. The paramedics had to ask, "Where is she?" Kim Dong-hun pointed to what looked like an empty recliner chair in the corner. Looking closer, they could see a person completely covered up to the neck with a blanket. The blanket had turned black, completely stained with feces. When the paramedic lifted that blanket, he couldn't believe what he saw. A woman in her 30s, wearing only a thin tank top. Her entire body was covered in feces and maggots. Some of the maggots had already become flies and were buzzing around the room. But it was worse than that. Her skin was rotting, necrotic tissue, fluid was oozing from the wounds, turning the floor beneath the recliner completely black. Even as the paramedics stood there, she was losing control of her bowels. She had no control over her own body anymore. Beside her was a phone resting on a stand. On the screen, an old television show from the early 2000s was playing. She was looking up at the screen, breathing shallowly, barely clinging to life. The paramedic later testified, "In all my years in emergency medicine, I'd never seen rotting skin like this on someone who was still alive." Seon-ah went into cardiac arrest during transport to the hospital. She received emergency treatment, but on November 18th, the next day, at around 10 in the morning, she passed away. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was sepsis, a life-threatening infection that occurs when bacteria enter the bloodstream. Test results showed she had 7 liters of fluid accumulated in her abdomen. She had lost 30 kilograms of body weight. Her bed sores had progressed beyond stage 4, the most severe medical classification. But the medical findings revealed something even more disturbing. A chest CT scan showed multiple rib fractures, from the 1st to the 6th rib on her right side. Medical experts confirmed these fractures weren't from CPR. The 1st rib is particularly thick and rarely fractures from chest compressions. This pointed to an external force, a possible assault. There was more. The necrosis on her shoulders and abdomen appeared to be caused by something other than bed sores. The shoulder wound in particular was the most recent injury, and doctors suspected it was caused by a stab wound. Forensic experts determined that for her condition to deteriorate this far, she must have been neglected for at least 3 months, possibly longer. The hospital immediately reported the case to police. They suspected neglect, and possibly something worse. But what was especially strange was Dong-hun's reaction. When the attending physician showed family members' photos to explain Seon-ah's condition, Dong-hun, who had been living with her in that same apartment, collapsed as if he had seen her suffering for the first time. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know my wife was this bad." Did he really not know? They lived together in the same house. In that house, the stench was overwhelming enough to make a trained paramedic recoil at the front door, a smell that even emergency responders found hard to bear. How could Kim Dong-hun know nothing? The paramedic who responded to the call asked Dong-hun directly, "Why didn't you call for help sooner?" "I thought my wife would overcome it on her own," Dong-hun replied. The paramedic pressed him. So for 3 months, you just left her in this condition and did nothing? Dong-hun didn't answer. Later, Dong-hun changed his story. He claimed he'd never told the paramedic that she'd been like that for 3 months. But the paramedic's testimony was clear and consistent. He said he asked multiple times, and each time Dong-hun confirmed. 3 months ago was when the necrosis began, when the maggots started appearing. Legal experts noted that Dong-hun's denial was predictable, claiming ignorance was his best defense to escape criminal liability, but the medical evidence would make that defense extremely difficult to maintain. Forensic analysis could determine approximately when the necrosis began. Combined with the paramedic's testimony about what Dong-hun said at the scene, it would serve as powerful evidence against him. Investigators also discovered something that directly contradicted his claims of ignorance. During the months when Seon-ah was dying, the household's water usage skyrocketed to over 40 tons per month. A typical one-person household uses about 10 tons of water monthly. Even a 4-person family uses only 18 to 20 tons. For a 2-person household to use 40 tons is simply impossible under normal circumstances. Experts believe Dong-hun may have been running water continuously, possibly to wash away evidence or to mask the smell of decay. Electricity bills also spiked abnormally during the same period. Analysts believed he may have been running the air conditioner around the clock to mask the smell. When asked why he hadn't noticed the smell coming from his wife's condition, Kim Dong-hun claimed he used fabric deodorizer and incense sticks. So he didn't notice, he said. Despite these claims, the evidence pointed to one conclusion. Dong-hun knew exactly what was happening, and he was actively trying to hide it. During that same period, Dong-hun kept contacting his in-laws with reassuring messages. 11 days before the 119 call, he sent a message to his mother-in-law. Seon-ah ate grilled pork and cabbage soybean paste soup today. The mother-in-law was relieved. She believed that even if her daughter's mental health wasn't perfect, at least she was eating well. While Dong-hun was sending these messages of normalcy, he was allowing his wife to literally rot away on that recliner. On November 16th, the day before the emergency call, Dong-hun posted a photo in the family group chat. He sent a picture showing that he had cleaned the bathroom. He also reported that he had fed his wife soup. One detail about this came out later. Dong-hun said that while feeding her soup that day, his wife spilled it on the blanket. When he tried to change the blanket, he saw his wife's feet. They were completely black, he claimed. If he saw her feet had turned black, why did he only call for help then? Seon-ah's case fits into a larger and deeply troubling pattern in South Korea. This happens more often than many people realize. 1 in 6 couples in South Korea experience physical violence in their relationship. Many more endure psychological abuse. But here's the critical cultural factor. 50% of South Korean adults report that they would not call the police for an incident of marital violence. Why? Because they view it as a family matter, a private issue, not a crime. This cultural belief stems from Confucian traditions that emphasize family harmony and privacy above individual safety. The law itself often focuses on preserving family unity rather than protecting victims. This inadvertently allows abuse to continue unchecked, hidden behind closed doors. Seon-ah fit this pattern perfectly. She was isolated, she was financially dependent, she was culturally conditioned to keep family problems private, and that made her profoundly vulnerable. In 2021, South Korea had only 65 domestic violence shelters for women across the entire country. That year, 1,547 women were housed in these facilities, but nearly 30% of them returned to their abusers after leaving. The system is failing these victims. Facilities are overcrowded, living conditions are precarious, services are inadequate. Women experiencing severe trauma, depression, or suicidal thoughts often don't receive the specialized care they desperately need. Similar cases have emerged in recent years. In May 2024, in Dongtan District, a woman was continuously threatened by her ex-boyfriend. She was kidnapped, she was murdered, despite multiple reports to police, despite emergency protection orders, despite prior intervention. These cases reveal systemic failures, failures in protection, failures in accountability, failures in treating domestic violence as the serious crime it is. And then there's the question that haunts this case. Seon-ah had a smartphone right beside her. She could have called anyone, her family, her friends, emergency services, but she didn't. Why not? Experts suggest 3 possible explanations. First, physical inability. Her body had deteriorated to the point where she simply couldn't move. Second, psychological domination. She was so completely dependent on her husband that she couldn't conceive of calling for help. Third, complete isolation. Dong-hun had deliberately cut off all her connections to the outside world, and she had no options left. Or perhaps something more sinister. Perhaps she physically couldn't call for help because she was restrained in that chair, unable to reach the phone at all. On December 15th, 2024, military prosecutors indicted Kim Dong-hun on murder charges, not abandonment resulting in death, which would have been the lesser charge, murder. Prosecutors determined that the legal concept of murder by omission applied in this case. This means that when a person has a legal duty to protect or care for another person and they intentionally fail to act, resulting in death, it can be prosecuted as murder. Dong-hun had a legal obligation to seek medical treatment for his dying wife. He didn't, and prosecutors believe this failure was intentional. The trial will be held at the 2nd Regional Military Court. This isn't the first time Korean courts have applied murder by omission in domestic cases. In September 2023, the Supreme Court upheld murder by omission convictions for a woman named Lee Eun-hae and her boyfriend. They were accused of coercing Lee's husband, who feared water, into jumping into a stream without safety equipment, leading to his death. Lee was sentenced to life in prison. Her accomplice received a 30-year prison term. Legal experts noted that even if Dong-hun's case were treated as simple abandonment resulting in death, it could carry at least 3 years in prison. But given the severity of this case, the body necrotizing, fluid oozing, maggots crawling, flesh rotted to the point where she couldn't even feel pain, a sentence of 5 to 7 years, or even up to 10 years, is possible. But the mystery remains. What was Dong-hun's motive? What did he gain from this? These questions have yet to be answered. We can only hope they will be revealed at trial. Criminal profiler Bae Sang-hoon, discussing this case on radio, stated flatly that Dong-hun's claim of ignorance was a complete lie. Looking at her state when she was found, with her lower body paralyzed and flesh rotting from necrosis, there was no way the husband didn't know. But Bae went further. He suggested this might not be simple neglect at all. Seon-ah's family still cannot forget that day when they learned the truth. They torture themselves with questions about how much pain Seon-ah must have been in. What it must have felt like as her body slowly died around her, as maggots crawled across her skin. Her sister spoke through tears. "How did my sister end up like this?" she asked. "She didn't cry out for help. She didn't say she was in pain. I keep wondering why she couldn't tell us the truth." The mother visits her daughter's grave every day. On Seon-ah's birthday, she brought a cake made with all the things her daughter used to love, small remembrances of a life cut short. The father couldn't even look at his daughter's photo. He held back his tears, but the grief was visible in every line of his face. The family has vowed to see this through to the end, to do everything possible to discover the truth, to ensure that Seon-ah receives justice. Medical experts said that if Seon-ah had been found just a few days earlier, she could have been saved. There was a possibility of recovery, but she never called for help. No, she was unable to. Whether that inability was physical, psychological, or because she was actively prevented, we may never fully know. We cannot know what Dong-hun was thinking. We cannot see into his mind or understand his motivations. But what we do know are facts. His actions were cruel. His treatment of Seon-ah was inhuman. His negligence was lethal. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, about control, about systems that fail to protect the vulnerable, about cultural beliefs that keep abuse hidden until it becomes lethal. We can only hope that the trial brings justice for Seon-ah and her family, that the full truth emerges, that Dong-hun is held accountable for what happened in that apartment. But justice in one case isn't enough. Seon-ah's death reveals systemic problems that require systemic solutions. More shelters, better protection laws, cultural change that treats domestic violence as a crime, not a private family matter. Support systems that intervene before it's too late. The fact that nearly 30% of abuse victims return to their abusers after leaving shelters tells us the system is broken. The fact that half of South Korean adults wouldn't call police for domestic violence tells us the culture needs to change. Seon-ah deserved better. She deserved a system that protected her. She deserved neighbors who checked. She deserved a culture that didn't tell her to keep family problems private. She deserved a husband who loved her instead of destroying her. We may never know the full truth of what happened in those final months, but we can honor Seon-ah's memory by ensuring that what happened to her doesn't happen to others. So what do you think? What really happened in that apartment? And how do we prevent the next case? That's all for today. Thank you for watching.